Mark and Marie were young college students who dated through most of their high school years and attended a state university together while living in a dorm in separate rooms on separate floors. They requested an appointment with the Student Counseling Center after they had an emotional conflict that they felt they could not resolve themselves, as they believed it interfered with their student life and threatened their plan to get married in the future. They detailed to the school therapist a complicated conflict where Marie called Mark and learned that he did not feel well and asked if he needed anything to eat. Mark specifically asked for some ramen noodles as he had a stomach bug and thought he could keep those down. After agreeing to make the noodles and bring them downstairs, Marie showed up instead with a big slice of double chocolate cake on a nice china plate, and this started a firestorm between the two. Mark was angry that Marie did not bring what he asked for and questioned why she would ask him what he wanted and then do something otherwise. Marie was hurt and offended that her offering to the chocolate cake was so quickly rejected and brought back an angry response. Both parties displayed a strong emotional reactivity as Mark was insistent that Marie was being self-absorbed and didn't care about him, or she would have brought him the noodles he would actually eat. Marie was equally determined to see his angry response as proof that Mark doesn't accept her efforts to show him love and rejection of her most heartfelt offerings. Both are certain of their interpretations of the other's behavior and speak to each other's feelings, values, and motives as though they certain foolproof knowledge of what goes on inside each other's heads. Both were very angry and offended about being told how they feel, think, and believe by the other. The school therapist let out a big sigh at the prospect of untangling this tangled emotional mess and then went to work. It's absolutely normal for anyone in a relationship, any kind of relationship, to try to figure out what the other person is thinking or feeling deep inside, or what they mean by what they say or what their body language shows. This is completely normal and understandable, and something we do by necessity every day. We do it when a message or an action is not comprehensively clear in its meanings or implications for a relationship. We do it with employers, employees, parents, children, strangers on the street, and we especially do it in any personal relationship where their stakes are very, very high and we are super emotionally invested. I'm going to state that the percentage of times that we guess correctly is probably a good indicator of how successful our lives and relationships go, and that people in general want to get it right, even if they generally don't get it right or struggle to get it right most of the time. Sometimes it's easy and understandable to figure out what someone is trying to tell us about how they feel about us, how they feel about others, or what their values are, or what they believe, and it's kind of on us to find a way to screw that up. Other times messages are clouded because of the natural differences between men and women in how they see and feel about things. Perhaps it is because we come from different cultures, different age groups, or just because we see things differently and don't realize it. I picture this process as similar to playing the old board game Clue, where a player has to go through a series of processes to formulate a best guess as to who killed the victim, where they did it, and with what weapon. Sometimes you go through the series of clues and put together a best guess that Professor in the conservatory with the candlestick, and you pull the solution cards out of the little secret sleeve, and you find out you got it right on the money. And other times you find out that it was really Mrs. Peacock who was the culprit. Or that it was really Professor Plum, but that he did the murder in the kitchen instead of the conservatory. Sometimes I talk about in session about those misunderstandings between family members or married couples is a big plot device in almost every sitcom episode that's ever been produced, and can even reference episode after episode of the cartoon show The Flintstones as proof of this, as Fred and Wilma never seem to get each other right, until the end of the show anyways, and always assume they understand. So understanding that trying to do what Mark and Marie were trying to do is completely normal at its core and is understandable is a good starting point. However, it also illustrates a truth about relationships that every marriage counselor who has ever seen a couple can speak to with certainty. The truth is that this is a very normal process that can become something incredibly toxic and destructive when one person insists that they know for sure what that solution cards are in that sleeve and are willing to fight for that belief. Anyone trained in cognitive behavioral therapy would immediately identify this insistent belief as a distorted way of thinking called mind reading, and as something that is pretty deeply rooted in clinical depression as experienced by an individual. The belief that we all have a way of seeing the world, and we try to imprint that way of seeing the world on situations to justify the beliefs we already have in place. People who are suffering from depression will usually, if not always, place a negative interpretation on an action even when it is not deserved or merited. Now, to be fair, everyone does this thing called mind reading to one degree or another. The question is, how often do we do it, and how passionately do we defend our initial interpretations in the light of additional evidence being presented? We are definitely talking about a degree of intensity and frequency much in the same way we are talking about someone who drinks alcohol and whether they are an alcoholic. It is all in the intensity and frequency, and whether you continue to do it when it is not good for you to do it, and it ends up being destructive on a physical, financial, emotional, and relational level in your life. Let's differentiate between a healthy way of dealing with the need to understand and interpret what other people feel, think, and believe. First of all, let's accept that the goal of this process is not to be initially right out of some sort of principle or to justify one's own beliefs, but rather to clearly understand and process the other person's true feelings, motives, beliefs, and actions. This is big. I can tell you from many, many experiences with couples, families, and work environments that it is not always the goal of individuals or families or companies, and that sometimes he, she, or they are more interested in justifying a personal belief or a communal value than they are in getting it right. The only way to truly win at this process is to put aside self-justification and fix our eyes firmly on accurately seeing inside another person and understanding them in a clear and certain way. I'm going to lay out three very simple premises. I'm going to lay out three very simple premises to help you win at relationships and not end up like Mark and Marie, having a screaming match over chocolate cake and ramen noodles that didn't do either one of them any good except to bring misery into their own lives. Premise number 1. People generally know how they feel and what they think. Notice I said generally here. Let's agree that sometimes people, especially children, who have not developed emotionally or cognitively, do not definitively know how they feel about something in their lives, or have not developed final and deep thoughts that are concrete in their conclusions about a certain subject. There are always exceptions to every rule, but I'm going to argue that people almost always know what their favorite color is, mine is purple, or what their favorite food is, Mexican, no question, or whether they like dogs or cats better. Never had a dog, love cats. And virtually no one would argue this fact with me. So what goes wrong then? Well, two things usually screw up this premise. The first thing that screws up this is that we may not like what someone else likes, so we want to change what they feel and think. This may be because we want them to feel and think the way we do for a relationship convenience, or out of some deep-seated anxiety or fear that not feeling and thinking the same way is going to cause the relationship to not work out and someone is going to get hurt. I think this is fairly common, and folks tend to worry that if there are too many differences, they will not be able to get along with the other person. The second thing that screws this premise up is when someone says to themselves, "You don't believe, feel, or think the right thing," and wants to change what the other person thinks or feels because they believe that their own values or interpretations are more right and superior. This goes on every time a door is knocked on by someone in a shirt and a tie who wants to hand out religious material from their faith and discuss why you need to change what you think and feel to do what they do. I will say that living this premise successfully means that you accept that other people have their own individual lives full of different feelings, thoughts, beliefs, and decisions that you cannot completely see. It is also generally offensive for someone to tell you, or for you to tell them, that what they feel, think, and believe is wrong. Now, there are obviously times when you need to challenge someone's beliefs, values, feelings, or underlying thoughts, and I can speak to the reality that cognitive behavioral therapy is intended to do just this. I regularly challenge someone's distorted views of themselves or the world as part of trying to treat clinical depression, and do it each and every day, multiplied over. Hopefully, though, it is done with the permission from my clients as someone is coming to me and saying, help me figure out the way I should think and believe and reality test better so that I can feel less depressed and that I am being careful to understand what they really do believe in, think, and feel about themselves and the world around them. Premise number 2. You cannot read someone's mind better than they can. Again, this premise too comes with certain conditions. Let's get those out of the way at the beginning. Sometimes people are not honest about what they really feel, think, and believe, and they may lie about it. I have spent a lot of time watching the investigative Discovery television network over the years and have seen countless, and I mean countless, examples of someone denying the truth in an interrogation room in front of detectives about how they feel or what they thought or what their motives or actions were. Sometimes this was done to such a ridiculous degree of uncertainty that anyone who watches crime shows has seen someone deny these things in the face of overwhelming evidence otherwise. The joke I always think about in my mind is that when someone is confronted with clear video evidence that they committed a crime, with multiple witnesses confirming that they committed the crime, and DNA evidence confirming that they committed a crime, and that they will deny to the death that it wasn't them, and instead it was someone who looked and dressed just like me and stole my DNA. But even in these cases, I will argue, the perp in the interrogation room absolutely did know what they did and why they thought and felt the way they did leading up to the criminal act in question. It was always a matter of them finally admitting what they knew to be true deep down. That being said, to accept this premise is to accept the individuality of someone else. You are accepting that they are a separate person who has an entire life full of unique experiences and private interpretations that cause them to think and feel and believe the way they do. This is a powerful thing to accept, and it is an adult thing to accept. One of the roots of depression is that the child, who is experiencing some sort of rejection, neglect, or abuse, cannot understand and process what an adult is thinking, feeling, and doing. So the child will personalize it because of them. So little Johnny, who is 8 years old, is not going to be able to understand why his dad gets liquored up a couple times a week and comes home hangry and lashes out with a vicious temper, because he cannot understand from personal experience why an adult would do this. Johnny then assumes it's because of him not being a good enough child. It is absolutely part of treating depression then, to develop the ability to perceive other people as true individuals who act out of choice, character, and values, and not as someone that we try to take responsibility for and assume they are acting that way because of us. Again, this is a very difficult thing to do. Few people seem to be able to do it with skill and consistency. This is why few people are truly accepting of each other's differences. And we can see this every time a fight over politics breaks out on social media. The core premise remains an acceptance of our own limitations to understand what other people feel, think, believe, and also an acceptance that other people are limited in being able to understand what we think and feel and experience deep down as well. Now, this goes against the grain of our cultural training about relationships, as the myth of soulmates is a tasty delusion that people snack on like salty popcorn at a movie theater. They would like to believe that relationships are easy and that you can synchronize completely with another human being and not have to deal with any of these complicated differences. I will also have to say that there are some unethical people in my profession that love to sell the myth of complete intimacy and complete familiarity for the sake of selling books or memberships to dating services. Nevertheless, it remains a lie to believe that it is possible to understand immediately and without investigation the incredible complications that exist within others around us. I remember specifically talking about this with my own wife when she worked as an office manager for a group practice that I was a part of. We both talked about how surreal it was that she spent most of her workday literally 10 feet away from where I saw my clients as our rooms faced each other. She could see through the blinds in her windows into the room where I worked, and she had absolutely no idea the complex interactions I had with 30 people a week, even though she knew them and checked them in. She could see into the room where I was working, but only could guess at the complicated interpersonal exchanges, the things that were said, felt, and perceived in that room. And likewise, I had no idea what she was thinking and feeling, being on the phone with insurance companies, logging new clients in, or trying to resolve billing snafus or interpersonal or inter-office squabbles. It highlighted the natural gulf that exists between people that were experimentally and physically close to each other. Accepting these differences is limiting initially, but then opens up a myriad of fascinating and rewarding interchanges that you can explore as someone else's world with them and earn their trust and respect doing so. Admittedly, this is the concept that is difficult to put into play. Premise 3. You have to become good at investigation. No one is going to investigate something that they already believe that they know. Let me say this again for the record, just so we're clear. No one is going to investigate something they already believe they know. This is the root of almost all marital and relationship unhappiness. The belief that I don't have to do any investigation because I already know what you think and feel, and I can know what you think and feel, and I'm going to tell you and argue with you about what you think and feel. What ends up happening is the two people end up fighting for control over what the other person believes or means. There is nothing more infuriating in my experience than someone else being willing to die on the hill in a fiery explosion because they think they know what you think and feel better than you do. This is absolutely what happened to the young couple that were described in this scenario at the start of this chapter. Mark believed he absolutely knew, according to his male world, upbringing, and cognitive style of being, that Marie was deliberately violating the rule that you shouldn't ask someone what they want if you're not willing to follow through with what they say. He also believed that she was deliberately ignoring his logical request for something and swapped it for something that wasn't useful and that only benefited her. If he had interpreted her correctly, and my guess is that he never considered that, there might be an alternative explanation for her decision to bring the cake, then he would have been correct in being angry, because as men, we joke about, if you ask your buddy to hand you a screwdriver and he hands you a wrench, you hit him over the head with the wrench for being an idiot. This is definitely a male way of seeing things. However, Marie believed Mark rejecting her loving act that was done with good motives was actually him wantonly rejecting her at a core level. The anger at being misunderstood was intensified by each insisting that they clearly read and understood the other's motives. In turn, became enraged at being told by the other that you don't know how you feel. Nothing can cause a firefight quicker than having your individuality being denied by someone close to you, and by having someone try and define you as someone you know yourself to not to be. The issue behind the premise is to take a cautious and investigative approach in your relationships. Maybe you need to create a necessary pause, sort of a time out from the flow of potential conflict and misunderstanding, to explore and make sure you understand how another feels, and for understand for certain what they mean by their words, gestures, and actions. This is not something that can be achieved, I don't think, by a standard tactic promoted by generic therapists of counting to 10 before getting angry. I'd say it is achieved by recognizing that other people, especially the opposite sex, likely have a completely different set of assumptions, values, beliefs, and motivations that we can immediately see both foundationally on a permanent basis and are not easily and readily understood at face value in immediate reactions either. Sometimes it is just what is suspected they thought. Sometimes it is just what you suspected they thought or felt for sure. But it never hurts to get confirmation before making a concrete decision of how to react. Accepting the not knowing for sure part of this premise is the core piece behind avoiding the relationship mess that Mark and Marie, and just about everyone else who has ever had an intimate relationship, got themselves into, and building that instinctive pause into your interactions that can increase intimacy and understanding and avoid needless fights over misunderstandings. Remember, the goal is to get it right in the end, not justify what you already believe or want to believe about someone else. The therapist spent the first couple of sessions confidently listening and validating both Mark and Marie and their respective hurt feelings, and believed they were both misunderstood in order to slow down the energy and anger between them. He did this to get them both to hear each other and recognize that they were fighting over how to interpret this problematic event. Then the counselor introduced the concept of mind reading and confronted the young couple with the reality that the only person who can truly and accurately speak to what they feel and think and what their motives and underlying values are in a specific situation is that person, and that person alone. The couple seemed surprised by this offering, as they never really thought about it this way, and tentatively agree with this statement, and were willing to go forward with the rule that they do not get to speak with certainty as to what the other thinks, feels, believes, and values. At this point, the tangled knot began to show some signs of improvement, as the true nature of the conflict became uncovered. From Mark's perspective, he was asking for Marie to make him the noodles from a pragmatic need to have food that he was capable of eating with an active stomach illness. He assumed she understood this request and that she simply decided to bring something that he couldn't eat as some sort of strange showy display of affection to obtain praise and attention. From Marie's perspective, she heard that Mark didn't feel well in an emotional sense, and it wasn't clear that he was physically ill. She simply wanted to both cheer him up and make him feel better by showing him how much she loves him, and couldn't understand why he would reject this effort. In a slow process of differentiating their feelings about the incident, the couple began to understand that they drastically misinterpreted each other and mislabeled their actions as proof that the other doesn't really love me. With a little more work, they both accepted that they should have paused and asked questions and spent some much needed energy to investigate, and that they both jumped to conclusions. Both parties agreed that they could and should have asked for clarification, and that if they could have understood what the other really meant and felt when Marie would have gladly made the noodles, and Mark would have graciously explained that the cake was a wonderful idea, but they could instead share the cake on the dorm balcony together in a romantic moment a few days later. Both agreed to ask more questions and not assume that they could read the other's mind, and resumed having a healthier and happier relationship that is more respectful and more functional. Mark and Marie presumably got married and had a fruitful life together as a couple. I shouldn't have to tell you what I want or tell you what to do.